Welcome to this journey through one of the most brutal and defining battles of World War II, the Battle of Stalingrad. For over 5 months, this city on the Volga River became the epicenter of human endurance, suffering, and sacrifice. What began as a Nazi quest for domination ended up reshaping the course of history. In today's video, we'll uncover the untold stories of bravery, survival, and the unimaginable horrors that unfolded in the ruins of Stalingrad. From civilians turned soldiers to the relentless urban warfare that trapped both sides in a deadly standoff. The Battle of Stalingrad was much more than a military conflict. It was a testament to the human spirit. But before we dive deep, I want to hear from you. How do you think ordinary civilians became warriors in the face of such overwhelming odds? Let me know in the comments below, and be sure to like and subscribe for more stories from history. Now, let's take you inside the heart of the bloodiest battle ever fought, Stalingrad. The bloodiest battle of World War II, untold stories of brutality and survival. The Battle of Stalingrad is often described as the single most brutal and decisive battle of World War II. Stretching from August 1942 to February 1943, it was not just a military engagement, it was a harrowing test of human endurance, survival, and resolve. Located on the banks of the Volga River in southern Russia, Stalingrad became the site of a fierce and unrelenting struggle between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. What began as a campaign to seize vital resources and weaken the Soviet war effort evolved into a battle of attrition, one of the bloodiest in history, where the price of victory would be measured in human lives rather than territory. At the heart of this battle was more than just a strategic city. Stalingrad was symbolic, named after the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. It represented the heart of Soviet resistance and the embodiment of Soviet strength. Adolf Hitler, in his quest for total domination over the Eastern Front, knew that if Stalingrad could be captured, it would deliver a powerful psychological blow to the Soviet people and solidify German control over the Caucasus oil fields. To Hitler, the fall of Stalingrad was as much about breaking Soviet morale as it was about securing vital resources for his war machine. But as history would unfold, Stalingrad would not fall easily. Instead, it would become a symbol of the Soviet Union's resilience and the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. What began as a battle for control of a city rapidly turned into a desperate struggle for survival, not only for soldiers but for civilians trapped in the epicenter of war. From the outset, the German Wehrmacht, under General Friedrich Paulus, launched a brutal assault on the city, supported by the might of the Luftwaffe. The bombing campaign was one of the most destructive in history. Over 1,000 bombers descended upon the city, turning it into a fiery wasteland. Factories, homes, schools, everything that could be destroyed was reduced to rubble. Yet, the destruction did not break the will of the Soviet people. Stalin's famous order, "Not one step back," resonated deeply within the hearts of the defenders. Stalingrad was not merely a clash of armies. It was a fight fought at the most intimate level. Buildings became fortresses. Streets became battlegrounds. The fighting descended into brutal urban warfare, where snipers hid in the rubble, infantrymen fought hand to hand in the ruins, and every inch of ground had to be wrestled from the enemy's grip. In this environment, conventional military tactics had little place. The battle became one of attrition, with both sides unwilling to give quarter. What's often overlooked in the grand narratives of battles won and lost are the untold stories of survival, human suffering, and the mental toll of living in a city under siege. Civilians, many of whom had never known the horrors of war, were thrust into the conflict. Men, women, and even children fought to protect their homes and families, often taking up arms themselves or performing other essential tasks to support the Soviet war effort. The civilian population of Stalingrad endured unimaginable hardships. Many were forced to live underground in makeshift shelters, surviving on the smallest rations, trying to hold onto the flickering hope that help might come, only to see that hope slowly fade as the days turned into months. The soldiers too faced overwhelming challenges. For the Germans, the long-awaited victory in Stalingrad turned into a deadly trap. The harsh winter weather, combined with Soviet counteroffensives, left the once proud Sixth Army trapped and isolated in the city by November 1942. The encirclement was a catastrophe. With no supplies, no reinforcements, and surrounded on all sides, the German soldiers faced starvation, frostbite, and disease. Their commander, General Paulus, caught between Hitler's refusal to allow a retreat and the horrific conditions of the city, found himself in a position no military leader ever wants to be in: desperate, defeated, and facing the impossible decision of whether to surrender. For the Soviet forces, it was a battle not just for their survival, but for the survival of their entire nation. The stakes could not have been higher. The Red Army had to hold Stalingrad or risk losing everything. The Soviet leadership, though, was not without its flaws. The infamous Order No. 227 was issued by Stalin to prevent any retreat at all costs, further intensifying the mental and emotional strain on the soldiers. This order placed immense pressure on the Soviet soldiers, but it also provided a clear message: retreat was not an option, and survival meant victory. In the end, the Soviet counteroffensive, known as Operation Uranus, encircled the German Sixth Army and sealed their fate. By February 1943, the battle was over. Over 2 million people had died, including soldiers, civilians, and prisoners of war. More than 200,000 German soldiers had either been killed or captured, and the loss of the Sixth Army was a crushing blow to the Nazis. Stalingrad, once a thriving industrial city, lay in ruins, but the Soviet victory marked a pivotal turning point in World War II. The Germans were on the retreat from that moment onward, and the Soviet Union would begin its march toward Berlin. Yet, beyond the numbers and military strategies, the true story of Stalingrad is one of human resilience, sacrifice, and an unyielding will to survive against insurmountable odds. The bravery of the Soviet defenders, the suffering of the civilians, and the courage displayed on both sides in the face of certain death have made Stalingrad an enduring symbol of the horrors of war and the strength of the human spirit. But as we begin this journey, ask yourself, what would you do if you were trapped in a city being bombed, surrounded by an enemy determined to wipe you out, with no hope of retreat, no supplies, and only death ahead? This is the story of the Battle of Stalingrad, a story that not only reshaped the course of World War II, but also shattered the illusion of invincibility that Nazi Germany once held. It is a story that speaks of resilience, sacrifice, and ultimate survival against all odds. As we delve deeper into this chapter of history, we will explore the untold stories of the men and women who fought and died in the ruins of Stalingrad. We will uncover the strategies, the emotional toll, and the complex decisions that shaped the course of one of the bloodiest battles ever fought. The Battle of Stalingrad is more than a military campaign. It is a testament to the human cost of war and a sobering reminder of the price of survival. Part 1. Prelude to Destruction. Hitler's 1942 Summer Offensive. It was a crisp spring morning on the 5th of April 1942. When Adolf Hitler sat behind his desk in the heart of the Reich Chancellery, the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. The world was at war, and the Third Reich, having tasted a series of victories in the early stages of the conflict, was eager to push forward. The air in Berlin was thick with ambition and a sense of inevitable triumph. Yet, unbeknownst to most, this decision and official decree signed that day would lead to the beginning of the end for Hitler's Nazi regime. Directive Number 41, Hitler's master plan for the summer of 1942, was a detailed outline of his most ambitious military campaign of the war. The goal was nothing short of total dominance over the Soviet Union, aiming to cripple its economy, seize its vital resources, and, most importantly, break its fighting spirit. The Caucasus region, rich with oil and resources critical for sustaining the German war machine, was the primary target. But there was something more symbolic at play, something Hitler believed could shatter Soviet morale forever. At the forefront of his mind was Stalingrad, a city named after Joseph Stalin, the very symbol of Soviet power. Capturing Stalingrad, Hitler thought, would crush the morale of the Soviets and deal a decisive blow to their resistance. If the Wehrmacht could seize it, they would have not just a strategic victory, but a psychological one as well. Hitler envisioned a rapid assault, a swift victory, and thought of Stalingrad as the gateway to the vast resources of the East. The complexity of the operation and the German Sixth Army. The operation was one of the most complex and vast military maneuvers ever conceived. It was not just an offensive, it was an orchestra of firepower, logistics, and military might. Leading this assault was the German Sixth Army, commanded by the meticulous and calculated General Friedrich Paulus. His forces, composed of crack infantry and armored divisions, were poised to march deep into the Soviet Union. But this wasn't a solo mission. Hitler enlisted the help of the Axis powers Italy, Romania, and Hungary, who would provide additional troops to support the German advance. These nations, despite their strategic importance, were woefully unprepared for the scale and ferocity of the battle ahead. For the Romanian and Italian forces, the idea of participating in such a grand campaign was initially appealing. They were eager to contribute to the Axis cause and claim a piece of the spoils of war. However, their optimism would soon give way to harsh reality. Lacking the necessary training, resources, and experience for such brutal combat, they would quickly find themselves overwhelmed by the unforgiving environment of the Eastern Front. Unlike the Germans, who had refined their war tactics, the Romanian and Italian soldiers were thrust into the heart of a battle that neither they nor their commanders were fully prepared for. The reluctant role of Axis allies. As the Germans pushed forward, the Romanian and Italian troops, though essential in the grand plan, faced a much more complex and terrifying battlefield. These soldiers, many of whom had expected a secondary role in the war effort, quickly found themselves confronting the unimaginable, entrenched Soviet forces who would not yield, a brutal winter, and, most harrowing of all, the city of Stalingrad itself. For the Italians, who had long fought in North Africa under Mussolini's command, the battles here were unlike anything they had ever experienced. Stalingrad was not just a distant target, it was a battleground that turned every street into a fortress, every home into a stronghold. The Axis soldiers had to dig into the rubble, battling not only the Soviet defenders, but also the conditions of war that were rapidly becoming impossible to endure. The Romanian forces, led by General Ion Antonescu, suffered greatly as well. Not equipped to withstand the harsh Eastern Front conditions, the Romanian soldiers quickly found themselves spread thin, fighting for their very survival. As the battle progressed and their positions grew more perilous, their morale was shattered. They were not only fighting for survival, but for an uncertain cause stuck in the middle of a conflict they were unprepared for. In the face of this overwhelming reality, the Allied soldiers, Romanian and Italian, joined the German forces in their unrelenting push towards Stalingrad. They soon found themselves involved in the same fight for survival that the Germans had initially thought would be theirs alone. Their once innocent optimism had been replaced by the stark horror of trench warfare, sniper attacks, and the looming threat of encirclement. The scale of destruction they witnessed was unlike anything they could have imagined. Stalingrad, a fortress in the making. Meanwhile, Stalingrad itself stood like a monument of resistance, its streets bearing the weight of Soviet determination. The city, which had once been a bustling industrial hub along the Volga River, was now preparing for a battle of historic proportions. General Vasily Chuikov, who would later become a key figure in the defense of the city, was appointed to command the Soviet 62nd Army. Under his command, the city would be transformed into an impregnable fortress. The civilian population too became part of the defense effort. Women, children, and elderly citizens who had never imagined they would have to pick up arms were pressed into service. Factories that once churned out steel and weapons for the Soviet war effort now became fortifications. The streets of Stalingrad, which had once been filled with the bustling life of a thriving industrial city, were rapidly turned into a deadly labyrinth. Homes, shops, and factories were stripped of anything that could be used to build barricades. Every civilian was involved, either working to fortify positions or helping to transport supplies to the front lines. The resilience of the Soviet defenders became apparent early on. The Germans had expected Stalingrad to fall quickly, just as they had anticipated the rapid defeat of the Soviet forces in the previous year. But what they encountered in Stalingrad was different. The Soviets, led by General Chuikov, fought tooth and nail to hold every inch of ground, forcing the Germans into brutal close-quarters combat. The shift in momentum. As the summer of 1942 wore on, the initial momentum of the German advance began to falter. The Germans had underestimated the resolve of the Soviet defenders and the harsh conditions they would face. What was initially intended to be a lightning-fast campaign quickly turned into a battle of attrition, with both sides taking heavy casualties. The city itself, once a symbol of Soviet strength, now became a symbol of defiance. Every street, every building, every corner became a battleground where neither side would give a quarter. With the brutal close-quarters combat grinding on through the summer, the Germans, despite their superior training and firepower, began to feel the strain. The Soviets, employing a strategy of attrition, drew the Germans deeper into the city, forcing them to fight for every inch of ground. The German Sixth Army, which had once been a symbol of Nazi efficiency and superiority, began to show cracks. The German forces were now trapped in a fight that neither side could win outright, each side simply hoping the other would break first. It wasn't until the Soviet counteroffensive Operation Uranus that the tide began to turn. Launched in November 1942, the Soviet forces struck at the weakest points of the Axis lines. They encircled the German Sixth Army, cutting off their supply lines and trapping them inside Stalingrad. At the time, Hitler refused to allow any retreat, and Paulus, despite his pleas, was left with no choice but to hold the city at all costs. The Germans were now surrounded, and the encirclement became a death trap. With winter closing in and supplies dwindling, the once powerful German Sixth Army was left to fight a war of survival, battling not only the Soviet forces but the freezing temperatures and the endless supply of horrors the city had to offer. By the 2nd of February 1943, the German Sixth Army surrendered. The battle had been a catastrophe for the Germans, resulting in the loss of over 200,000 soldiers. The fall of Stalingrad marked a turning point in World War II, as it broke the back of the German advance in the east. For the Soviets, Stalingrad became a symbol of their strength and resolve, a moment of victory that fueled their counter-offensive across Eastern Europe. The defeat at Stalingrad shattered the myth of Nazi invincibility. It would not be the last time the Germans would face defeat on the Eastern Front, but it was the beginning of their ultimate downfall. The story of Stalingrad would echo throughout history as a testament to human endurance, resilience, and the willingness to fight for survival even when everything seemed lost. Part 2. The March Towards Stalingrad. Early German Victories. By late June 1942, the German Wehrmacht was advancing relentlessly into Soviet territory. Their success seemed unstoppable. The mechanized armies, composed of panzer divisions and elite infantry, had crushed Soviet defenses in cities like Voronezh and left a trail of broken lines and shattered resistance in their wake. The German forces, under the strategic command of General Wilhelm von Paulus, had already pushed deep into the heart of the Soviet Union. The goal was clear. Stalingrad, the symbolic heart of Soviet strength, would be theirs. From the very beginning, the Wehrmacht had anticipated a rapid and overwhelming advance. The early successes were almost too easy. The panzer divisions, with their exceptional speed and firepower, tore through the Soviet defenses like a hot knife through butter. The German forces, under the strategic command of General Wilhelm von Paulus, had already pushed deep into the heart of the Soviet Union. The goal was clear. Stalingrad, the symbolic heart of Soviet strength, would be theirs. From the very beginning, the Wehrmacht had anticipated a rapid and overwhelming advance. The early successes were almost too easy. The panzer divisions, with their exceptional speed and firepower, tore through the Soviet defenses like a hot knife through butter. The momentum of their success was undeniable. They had taken Voronezh, one of the largest Soviet cities in the area, and pushed their lines far beyond expectations. Their weapons were superior, their tactics refined, and their drive for victory unrelenting. They thought of Stalingrad as just another obstacle to overcome, an inevitability on their road to total victory. But this overconfidence, this certainty of an easy victory, would soon become their greatest flaw. It was not long before the first signs of resistance began to emerge. The overconfidence, underestimating the Soviet will. The German High Command, which had always prided itself on its military genius, believed they were fighting a Soviet Union that was on the brink of collapse. They had underestimated the resilience and resolve of the Soviet people, and even more critically, the resolve of Joseph Stalin himself. Stalin, in the face of Hitler's relentless advance, had made a decision that would define the outcome of the battle. Stalingrad must be held at all costs. This decision, made by one of the most ruthless and calculating leaders in history, was not just a tactical move, but a statement of Soviet strength. The city was symbolic. It bore the name of the Soviet leader himself. Losing it would have been a blow to the heart of the Soviet Union. But Stalin's determination was not merely symbolic. His order to defend Stalingrad meant that every soldier, every civilian, and every volunteer would be pressed into service. On the German side, the overconfidence of their commanders blinded them to the tenacity of the Soviet defense. They believed that the Soviets were too exhausted from the previous year's fighting. After all, the Germans had been smashing through Soviet lines for months, and the Soviet Union seemed on the verge of collapse. The Wehrmacht believed they had already defeated the Soviets in the field, and they expected Stalingrad to be no different. The Germans didn't anticipate the depth of the Soviet spirit, the unwavering determination of a people who, having already endured unimaginable losses, would fight until the very last. This fatal underestimation of the Soviet will would soon prove to be their undoing. As they neared the city, the Germans began to realize that Stalingrad was not like any city they had encountered before. It wasn't simply a military target, it was a fortress. The Soviet response. A battle of desperation and defiance. Inside Stalingrad, the Soviet leadership knew that they were facing an existential threat. But General Vasily Chuikov, appointed to defend the city, had a plan, a strategy rooted in the very nature of the city itself. The Germans had relied on speed and maneuver, but Stalingrad was a city built for resistance. It was a labyrinth of streets, alleyways, and urban structures, perfect for close quarters combat. Chuikov's strategy would turn the city into a veritable death trap, forcing the Germans into the kind of urban warfare that would grind down even the most battle-hardened soldiers. The defenders of Stalingrad were a mixture of regular army soldiers, civilian volunteers, and NKVD officers, a diverse and often poorly equipped force, but one driven by sheer willpower and the instinct to survive. For the civilians, it was a battle for their very homes, a fight for their families and their livelihoods. The men who fought alongside them were often just as unprepared. Many had no experience in warfare beyond what they had seen in their homeland's darkest days. But they had something that the Germans had failed to calculate: a fierce determination to protect their city and their lives at all costs. The conditions inside Stalingrad were grueling. Supplies were limited, and morale often faltered as the fighting escalated. Yet, despite these challenges, the Soviet defenders held strong. They turned the city into a fortress, using every available resource. Factories were converted into strongholds, homes into bunkers, and entire neighborhoods became battlegrounds. Every inch of Stalingrad was contested, and the city's very structure became both a weapon and a prison. Rattenkrieg, the fight for every street, every building. As the German forces pushed into Stalingrad, they quickly realized they were no longer fighting a conventional army. The Soviets weren't retreating, they weren't collapsing. Instead, they were fighting for every building, every street corner, and every alleyway. The battle became known as Rattenkrieg, the Rat War. It was a fitting name for the kind of brutal urban combat that took place. Soldiers on both sides were forced to fight in close quarters, often in buildings so devastated by bombs that only the skeletal remains of structures remained. The dense urban terrain allowed for ambushes, sniper attacks, and hand-to-hand combat that would become the hallmark of this battle. The German soldiers, confident and well-equipped at the start of the campaign, found themselves stretched thin. Their momentum began to slow as they encountered fierce resistance from Soviet soldiers who fought with the desperation of those who had nowhere else to go. The Wehrmacht's initial successes began to falter, and the realization that they were facing an adversary unlike any they had faced before began to sink in. On the Soviet side, the defenders of Stalingrad, despite being poorly equipped and vastly outnumbered in terms of firepower, became experts in urban warfare. They turned every building into a fortress, using the rubble as cover and employing guerrilla tactics that caught the Germans off guard. The Soviets knew the city better than anyone. They were the masters of the terrain, and this knowledge allowed them to engage in brutal hit-and-run tactics that frustrated the Germans at every turn. General Chuikov understood that this battle would not be won through traditional military tactics. The Germans had superior numbers, equipment, and training, but the Soviets had something that could not be measured: unbreakable resolve. The streets of Stalingrad became a place where survival itself was the ultimate victory. The lure of the winter, the oncoming storm. As the battle raged on through the summer and fall, the Germans had not only underestimated the Soviet resolve, but also failed to take into account the harshness of the Russian winter. The Wehrmacht had fought in the bitter cold before, but nothing compared to the brutal conditions of a Russian winter. The temperature in Stalingrad would plummet, turning the battlefield into a frozen hellscape. The Soviet counteroffensive, the turning point. It was during this critical juncture, when the Germans were at their weakest, that the Soviets launched their counteroffensive. Operation Uranus, the plan to encircle and destroy the German Sixth Army, was set into motion in November 1942. With careful precision, the Soviet forces attacked the weaker Romanian and Hungarian troops guarding the flanks of the German position. General Chuikov, despite the hardships, continued to push his men forward, urging them to hold on, to fight for every inch of ground. The city, once a symbol of Soviet industry, was now a symbol of Soviet strength. The Germans, on the other hand, began to lose their grip. They were no longer advancing, they were being bogged down, exhausted by the unrelenting resistance. The Soviet counteroffensive, the turning point. It was during this critical juncture, when the Germans were at their weakest, that the Soviets launched their counteroffensive. Operation Uranus, the plan to encircle and destroy the German Sixth Army, was set into motion in November 1942. With careful precision, the Soviet forces attacked the weaker Romanian and Hungarian troops guarding the flanks of the German position. The Germans, now stretched thin and facing an increasingly hostile winter, were caught off guard. The pincer movement was executed flawlessly, trapping the German Sixth Army inside Stalingrad. The German forces, already exhausted and encircled, found themselves in a hopeless position. Their communications and supply lines were severed, and the once formidable Wehrmacht was now trapped in a city they had underestimated. The city of Stalingrad, once a symbol of German hubris, had become a symbol of their downfall. The fall of Stalingrad, a defining moment in history. By the end of January 1943, the German Sixth Army was effectively destroyed. General Paulus, who had once been so confident in victory, was now faced with the reality of defeat. His pleas for reinforcements had been ignored by Hitler, and now the German forces inside Stalingrad were being systematically destroyed. On the 2nd of February 1943, after months of relentless fighting, the German Sixth Army finally surrendered. The fall of Stalingrad marked a turning point in World War II. It was the first major defeat for the Germans on the Eastern Front, and the loss shattered the myth of German invincibility. For the Soviets, it was a hard-earned victory, one that would fuel their push westward and eventually lead to the liberation of Eastern Europe. But the human cost was staggering. The battle had claimed the lives of over 2 million people, both soldiers and civilians, and left Stalingrad in ruins. The battle for Stalingrad was more than just a military campaign. It was a story of survival, resistance, and the unyielding spirit of those who fought in its ruins. It stands today as a testament to the bravery of those who defended it, and as a reminder of the immense human cost of war. Part 3, The Heart of Stalingrad. Defending the city against a relentless enemy. By the summer of 1942, the vast expanse of the Soviet Union had been relentlessly battered by the might of the German Wehrmacht. The early victories had been swift, and German forces were pushing ever closer to their final goal, the city of Stalingrad, the gateway to the Soviet heartland. With each passing day, the soldiers on both sides grew weary, but the stakes were higher than ever. The Germans, eager for victory, saw Stalingrad not just as a military target but as a symbol, a city named after Joseph Stalin himself. It had to fall for the Germans to claim total dominance. In August 1942, the Luftwaffe, Germany's formidable air force, unleashed a series of devastating airstrikes on Stalingrad. The skies above the city became an inferno, blackened by smoke and filled with the deafening roar of bombers. The objective was clear: break the spirit of the Soviet defenders, cripple their morale, and soften the ground for the coming ground assault. The bombs fell like rain, relentless and unforgiving, hammering the city into oblivion. Every bomb that struck, every factory that crumbled, every street that was reduced to rubble, carried the weight of Hitler's ambition. The city that had once been a symbol of Soviet industrial might, a thriving metropolis on the Volga River, was now being reduced to a fiery wasteland. Buildings, factories, homes, anything that could be destroyed was obliterated in a thunderous explosion. Fires raged uncontrollably, fueled by the broken infrastructure and the oil-rich industrial sites that had once powered Soviet production. The once bustling streets of Stalingrad, filled with the hum of workers and the cries of children, became impassable ruins, nothing more than twisted metal and shattered concrete. The civilians of Stalingrad, who had already endured unimaginable hardship since the German invasion began, now found themselves facing the unimaginable. Their homes destroyed, their families torn apart, and their city set alight. For many, the horror of this destruction seemed too great to bear. But still, amidst the burning ruins, they held on. They fought not just because they were ordered to, but because Stalingrad was their home, their sanctuary, and their pride. And they weren't about to let it fall without a fight. A city transformed into a fortress. As the Luftwaffe's bombing campaign continued to ravage Stalingrad, the Soviet leadership, particularly General Vasily Chuikov, knew that the city's defense would depend on every last man, woman, and child. Stalin's orders were clear: not one step back. This wasn't just a directive. It was a lifeline for the soldiers and civilians alike. The Soviet Union had endured so much already, and now Stalingrad was their final bastion. To surrender it would be to surrender the very soul of the Soviet resistance. With the city in flames and chaos all around them, Chuikov and his officers began transforming Stalingrad into a fortress. Every building, every piece of rubble was utilized to fortify the Soviet defenses. What had once been a place of industry and commerce was now a battleground. Apartments became strongholds, factories became military headquarters, and streets became deadly corridors where every inch was fought for. The city was no longer just a place, it had become a symbol of Soviet resolve, an emblem of the indomitable will to resist, even in the face of total destruction. The Soviet Red Army soldiers, driven by a mix of fear, patriotism, and sheer survival instinct, dug in. They fought not just as soldiers, but as defenders of their homes and families. Their uniforms, once pristine and crisp, became stained with the grime of battle. They fought with a ferocity that only comes from knowing that retreat was not an option. Each trench they dug, each barricade they built, was fortified with the blood of their comrades. General Chuikov himself was often on the front lines, leading from the front and never hesitating to send his men into battle. His leadership was pivotal, inspiring the soldiers with his unwavering resolve. He reminded them that the battle wasn't just for Stalingrad, it was for the survival of their entire country. They were the last line of defense, and they would hold at any cost. But it wasn't just the soldiers who were involved in this battle. Stalingrad was a city of families. And these families who had once lived in the safety of their homes were now part of the fight. The civilians of Stalingrad became soldiers in their own right. The men, women, and children worked side by side with the army, helping to move supplies, tending to the wounded, and even picking up arms to join the defense. This was no longer just a military conflict, it was a battle for survival, one where every citizen had a role to play. The civilian toll, a city united in tragedy. The civilian toll in Stalingrad was staggering. Families who had once led peaceful lives were now thrust into the heart of one of the bloodiest battles in history. The sound of bombs falling echoed through the streets night after night, their blasts reverberating through the rubble. The city's residents, though frightened and weary, stood resilient. They gathered in makeshift shelters and underground bunkers, sharing what little food and water they had. In these dark, confined spaces, they told stories of life before the war, tales of a time when their homes were safe and their futures were full of promise. It was these memories that kept them going, fueling the fragile hope that somehow this nightmare would end. For the children, the horrors of war were not just something they read about in books, they lived it. Yet, even in the face of unimaginable fear and suffering, the children of Stalingrad demonstrated a maturity far beyond their years. They became messengers, running through the streets and across the city, dodging both bullets and bombs to deliver messages between the front lines and the families within the city. They were the lifeblood of the underground networks that kept the spirit of resistance alive. Despite the chaos around them, these children carried hope in their hearts, their actions more heroic than anyone could have imagined. The women of Stalingrad also played a critical role. As the men went to the front lines, women took up arms, standing shoulder to shoulder with the soldiers. Armed with rifles and determination, they fought at strategic positions throughout the city. The women were not just soldiers. They were mothers, wives, and daughters, fighting for the survival of their families and their homes. They embodied the very spirit of the city, unbending and unyielding, no matter the cost. Night after night, the skies above Stalingrad glowed with the orange-red hue of fires, and the ground trembled with the impact of the bombs. Yet, despite the devastation, there was an unbreakable bond among the people. In the face of such destruction, the citizens of Stalingrad showed the world the meaning of unity. They refused to give in, refusing to allow the city to be taken without a fight, a symbol of resistance. Outside the city, the German forces were relentless in their pursuit of victory. The Luftwaffe continued its bombardment, and the Wehrmacht advanced, determined to capture the city at any cost. But what they didn't understand was that Stalingrad was not just a city, it had become a symbol of resistance, a symbol of defiance. And more than anything, it was a symbol of the Soviet spirit that refused to break. The Germans had expected to crush the Soviet defenders quickly, just as they had done in so many other cities. They had anticipated a swift victory, believing that the Soviets would collapse under the weight of their military power. But what they encountered in Stalingrad was something entirely different. They faced an army and a civilian population that was prepared to endure any hardship, suffer any loss, and fight to the very last. The German strategy was failing. Each day, the Wehrmacht advanced, only to find themselves facing fierce resistance. The urban warfare wore down their troops. The harsh Russian winter loomed on the horizon, and with it, a new set of challenges. The Germans were fighting not only the Soviet defenders, but also the unforgiving elements, which took a devastating toll on their troops. They had underestimated the Soviet will to resist, and now they were paying the price for their arrogance. A turning point, the battle intensifies. As the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the battle for Stalingrad grew ever more intense. The city was reduced to rubble, but its defenders refused to surrender. Each street corner, every building, became a battleground. The Germans, who had once believed they were unbeatable, now found themselves bogged down in a nightmare they couldn't escape. The fight for Stalingrad was no longer just about territory, it was about survival. And it was a survival they could not afford to lose. But the Soviets, despite their hardships, began to sense a shift. The city was not just a place on a map anymore, it had become something greater. It had become a symbol of their resistance, their strength, and their willingness to fight until the very last. The people of Stalingrad, who had once known peace, now knew only war, but they fought for something deeper than mere survival. They fought for their homes, their families, and their very existence. In the face of death and destruction, Stalingrad had become a beacon of hope, a symbol that no matter how great the enemy, the human spirit could withstand the greatest trials. Part 4. The Brutality of Urban Combat, Close Quarters Fighting. As the German forces pressed deeper into the heart of Stalingrad, the once clear front lines began to dissolve, consumed by the chaos of urban combat. What had initially seemed like a straightforward conquest now descended into a brutal and unforgiving form of warfare, one where every building, every street corner, and every alleyway became the site of fierce, hand-to-hand battles. The city, once a symbol of Soviet industrial strength, had become a landscape of shattered walls and broken streets, a deadly maze where neither side could afford to give up ground. The Germans, accustomed to rapid victories across the Soviet Union, had expected to sweep through the city with the same efficiency. But Stalingrad was different. The city's labyrinthine streets and damaged infrastructure became weapons in the hands of those determined to defend it. The German soldiers, well equipped with superior firepower and advanced military tactics, initially gained ground. They had to. Their mission was clear: break through Soviet defenses, take Stalingrad, and continue the relentless march toward victory. The Wehrmacht's panzers, with their speed and overwhelming firepower, advanced swiftly through the outskirts, destroying whatever lay in their path. But the city's transformation from an urban center into a fortress of resistance was well underway. The Soviets, led by General Vasily Trikov, adapted quickly to the unforgiving conditions, turning every building into a bastion, every street corner into a potential death trap. They knew the land better than their invaders ever could, using the rubble and the ruins of Stalingrad as shields, as traps, and as battlegrounds. German soldiers, trained to fight in open fields and on vast front lines, found themselves trapped in an entirely new kind of warfare. No longer could they rely solely on the power of their tanks and artillery. Instead, they were forced to clear building after building, street after street, where Soviet soldiers waited in ambush at every corner, in every doorway, and behind every piece of debris. The Germans, confident in their previous successes, now struggled with the unknown terror that lurked around every corner. In Stalingrad, the war was fought at such a close range that even the most seasoned veterans could not predict where the next threat might emerge. There was no safe zone, no secure place to retreat, to just one building after another that needed to be cleared, one room after another that could be hiding a Soviet soldier waiting to strike. In this brutal, unrelenting battle, the Germans faced not only the Soviet military, but the resolve of every civilian within the city. People who had never dreamed of combat now fought side by side with the soldiers. Women, children, and the elderly, all caught in the unimaginable nightmare of war, picked up arms when they could, helped transport supplies, and did whatever was necessary to keep their city intact. Stalingrad, for all its suffering, had become the symbol of Soviet resistance, and its people would not abandon it. Every inch of it would be paid for with blood. But the most terrifying threat to the Germans came from an unseen enemy, an enemy that could strike without warning, without a trace, and leave nothing behind but death. The Soviet snipers, among the most feared warriors in the conflict, turned the urban landscape into their hunting ground. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, one of the deadliest snipers in history, became a living legend in Stalingrad. With over 300 confirmed kills, her precision and deadly accuracy struck fear into the hearts of the German soldiers. The sniper war in Stalingrad was not just a matter of military tactics. It was psychological warfare, a game of cat and mouse in the shadows of the city's ruins. The Germans, for all their superior weaponry and tactics, had underestimated the psychological toll that the snipers would take. They had grown accustomed to the steady advance of their forces, but in Stalingrad, they could no longer count on the certainty of their movements. Every German soldier became aware of the possibility that a single misstep, a moment of hesitation, could cost them their lives. The snipers, with their uncanny ability to remain unseen, created an invisible barrier between the Germans and their goal. The Luftwaffe's bombs could destroy entire buildings, but they could not destroy the Soviet snipers, who blended seamlessly into the environment, waiting silently for the perfect shot. As the days wore on and the battle became ever more intense, the snipers' role grew ever more critical. They weren't just sharpshooters. They were the psychological warriors of the battlefield. They instilled a pervasive sense of dread in the enemy, turning every corner, every shadow, into a potential danger. The Germans, who had once moved with confidence through the streets of Stalingrad, now found themselves slowing their advance, careful of every window, every doorway, and every open space. It was the kind of hesitation that can cripple an army's momentum, and it gave the Soviets precious time to regroup and launch counterattacks. Snipers like Pavlichenko didn't just aim to kill, they aimed to disrupt, to destroy the Germans' sense of security, and to shatter their morale. The Soviets understood that this invisible war was as crucial as the fighting on the ground. The psychological impact of a sniper's bullet, of knowing that an enemy was watching you from a distance, ready to strike, was devastating. The Germans had to think twice before advancing, questioning whether the space they were moving through had already been observed, whether a sniper was watching from the debris, waiting for them to step into their sights. The snipers used the city's ruins as their cover, setting up positions in the upper floors of abandoned buildings, behind piles of rubble, or within the remains of shattered factory walls. They knew the terrain better than the Germans could have imagined. The Germans, accustomed to open field combat, now had to contend with the reality that they were fighting not only the Red Army, but an invisible and relentless foe. They could no longer move through the city with the same speed and confidence that had carried them through other parts of the Soviet Union. In addition to Pavlichenko, there were other snipers, men and women alike, who became legends in their own right. Some were so skilled they could take down a target with a single shot. Others employed tricks to lure their enemies into the open, setting traps that made it impossible for the Germans to predict where the next bullet would come from. These snipers were not simply killing machines. They were strategic players in a battle of minds. The Germans, aware of this constant threat, had to alter their tactics, advancing with much more caution, often retreating when faced with the impossible challenge of urban warfare combined with sniper terror. This shift in German strategy gave the Soviets time to regroup, It allowed them to solidify their positions and prepare for the counteroffensive that would come. Stalingrad, which had once seemed like a lost cause, had become a place where every inch of ground mattered, where every single soldier, every civilian, and every sniper played a vital role in the defense of the city. The Germans were no longer advancing. They were being stalled, bogged down by a combination of relentless Soviet defense, their own overconfidence, and the devastating psychological impact of the sniper war. As the battle raged on, the sniper legends grew. Stories of Pavlichenko's kills, of the precision and deadly calm of the Soviet marksmen, spread throughout the ranks. Their presence was a constant reminder to the Germans that they were not fighting just another conventional battle. In Stalingrad, the fight was personal. It was a fight of attrition, not just of firepower, but of mental fortitude. The snipers, the soldiers, the civilians, everyone in Stalingrad knew that this battle was a test of endurance, and the cost of failure would be measured in lives, both Soviet and German. The urban combat, with its close-quarter battles and sniper warfare, would become the hallmark of Stalingrad. It was a fight that couldn't be won by firepower alone, but by tenacity, cunning, and an unyielding will to survive. And as the battle turned from a German advance into a desperate struggle to maintain control, Stalingrad became more than just a city. It became a symbol of resistance, of resilience, and of the human spirit's ability to endure even the most unimaginable horrors of war. Through the smoldering ruins of Stalingrad, amid the smoke and the shattered buildings, the Soviet defenders, soldiers, and civilians alike stood firm. And it was there, in the heart of that once great city, that the turning point of the war would be written, not just with guns and bullets, but with the blood, sweat, and tears of those who refused to surrender. Part 5, The Luftwaffe's Destruction, the Cost of Bombing Stalingrad. By August 23, 1942, the air above Stalingrad had become a hellscape. The sound of bombers grew louder and louder each day, and by the time the Luftwaffe launched their most devastating aerial assault, the sky seemed to crack open with the fury of war. More than 1,000 bombers, a staggering display of destructive force, flew over the city in a coordinated attack that would forever change its landscape. Their target was not just military positions, but the very soul of Stalingrad itself. The civilians, the infrastructure, the industries, the homes, all were to be obliterated in a single, devastating blow. The Luftwaffe's bombers unleashed their payloads, and the night sky was lit by the searing glow of incendiary bombs as they rained down, setting the city ablaze. The first bombs fell in a near-constant barrage, followed by waves of destruction that tore apart everything they touched. Factories, once humming with the rhythm of Soviet industry, were reduced to piles of twisted metal and ash. Homes, where families had once lived in peace, were turned into charred ruins. Streets, markets, and schools all became little more than smoldering debris. At first, it seemed as if the Germans had achieved their goal. Stalingrad was in flames, and the Soviets, who had already suffered so much in the war, appeared to be on the brink of collapse. The hope was that the bombing would demoralize the defenders and break the will of the population. But what the Germans had failed to understand, what they underestimated entirely, was the spirit of the Soviet people. Rather than crippling the resistance, the Luftwaffe's relentless bombardment had the opposite effect. It stilled the resolve of the citizens and soldiers alike. They had seen their homes, their city, and their livelihoods reduced to rubble, but they refused to give in. Stalingrad was not just a city, it was the last bastion of Soviet resistance, and it would not fall easily. The bombing raids, instead of breaking the people's spirits, ignited an unyielding fire within them. This was their home, and no amount of fire or destruction would make them surrender. Civilians who had once been nothing more than bystanders in the conflict now became active participants in the defense of the city. Women, children, and the elderly, people who had never held a weapon in their lives, were suddenly pressed into service. They helped to clear debris, carry supplies to the front lines, and fortify buildings that had not yet been destroyed. Some even picked up arms and joined the men in the streets, ready to fight and die for their home. The lines between soldier and civilian blurred in those harrowing days, as everyone in the city was now a defender. Amidst the chaos, stories of extraordinary bravery began to emerge. Tales of women who fought back with whatever they could find, armed with rifles, knives, or even makeshift explosives, became legend. One such woman was Yevdokia Zavali, a civilian who had watched her home be bombed to the ground. Instead of fleeing, she rushed to help the wounded and carried messages between the front lines. Her actions, though just one of many, became a symbol of the collective will to resist. For the Soviet people, their will to survive and fight back against the German invaders was unwavering. As the bombardment continued, it became clear that the Luftwaffe's plan to destroy the city spirit had failed. The Soviet people, battered and broken, dug deeper into the rubble and ruins, determined to fight on. Soldiers and civilians alike forged an unbreakable bond through shared suffering. The once great city of Stalingrad, reduced to a battlefield of destruction, became a fortress built on unity and resolve. The Luftwaffe's destruction, intended to obliterate any hope, instead fostered a sense of solidarity. The Germans had underestimated the power of a people who had already endured the unthinkable. They thought that bombing Stalingrad would break the Soviet resolve, but they didn't understand that Stalingrad was more than just a place. It was a symbol of Soviet determination. Each street that was obliterated, every factory that was bombed, became a rallying cry for those who remained. The more the city burned, the more the Soviet defenders fought back. The idea that they had to defend Stalingrad was no longer just about holding a city, it was about preserving the spirit of the Soviet Union itself. The Nazis, with their bombing raids, had hoped to break that spirit, but instead, they had fanned the flames of defiance. And those flames burned brighter with each passing day. As the Luftwaffe bombers flew over Stalingrad, scattering their incendiary payloads over the city, the survivors below knew they had only two choices: fight or die. For many, surrender was simply not an option. The horrors of war had already come to their doorstep, and they would face the terror with unflinching courage. In the midst of the smoke and destruction, a new kind of heroism began to take root. This spirit of defiance was felt by the Soviet military as well. In the wake of the Luftwaffe's raids, the Soviet command adapted quickly to the changing circumstances. The ruined landscape of Stalingrad, while devastating, was not without its advantages. The city's shattered buildings, though offering no protection from bombs, offered a perfect battleground for urban warfare. Every destroyed building, every abandoned home, became a sniper's nest, an ambush point, or a strategic position to stage counterattacks. General Vasily Chuikov, who was entrusted with the defense of the city, knew that he couldn't fight the Germans in traditional ways. The Soviet army, despite being vastly outgunned and outnumbered, would have to turn Stalingrad into a quagmire for the invaders. The German tanks, which had so easily swept through cities earlier in the war, found themselves slowed to a crawl in the ruins of Stalingrad. What was once a city of industry had become a city of death, and the Germans were being drawn into its labyrinth, where their strength in numbers and firepower would be nullified by the brutal, close-quarters combat of the streets. The bombing had transformed Stalingrad into a battlefield where every inch was contested. Every window, every alley, every rooftop had become a deadly vantage point for the defenders. The Soviet forces quickly adapted to this new form of warfare, using their knowledge of the city's terrain to set up ambushes and traps. The Germans, unable to move quickly through the rubble, found themselves losing more and more men to sniper fire, artillery, and surprise attacks. The Luftwaffe's attempts to obliterate the city had, ironically, made it more dangerous for the invaders. Every window, every alley, every rooftop had become a deadly vantage point for the defenders. The Soviet forces quickly adapted to this new form of warfare, using their knowledge of the city's terrain to set up ambushes and traps. The Germans, unable to move quickly through the rubble, found themselves losing more and more men to sniper fire, artillery, and surprise attacks. The Luftwaffe's attempts to obliterate the city had, ironically, made it more dangerous for the invaders. Meanwhile, the civilians, though devastated by the loss of their homes, fought on with equal determination. The civilians of Stalingrad, once merely part of the city's population, had now become part of the war effort. They worked tirelessly to rebuild defenses, to carry ammunition to the front lines, and to provide medical care to the wounded. The women of Stalingrad, in particular, became a symbol of resilience. Many of them took up arms, manning anti-aircraft guns, and fighting side by side with the soldiers. Their determination and courage in the face of overwhelming odds became an integral part of the Soviet resistance. The Luftwaffe's bombing campaign had been intended to break the Soviet will and pave the way for a German victory. Instead, it had done the opposite. It had forged an unbreakable bond between the soldiers and civilians of Stalingrad. It had made them stronger, more determined, and more united in their defense of the city. And it had turned Stalingrad from a target of military conquest into a symbol of resistance that would inspire future generations. As the battle raged on, the Germans found themselves bogged down in a fight they could not win. Stalingrad, reduced to rubble, became the most stubborn fortress imaginable. Its defenders, though beaten and broken, refused to surrender. The sacrifices of the people and soldiers of Stalingrad became a defining moment in the war, a symbol of unwavering resolve and the ultimate triumph of the human spirit. For every bomb that fell from the sky, for every street that was turned into a battleground, the spirit of Stalingrad grew stronger. The Luftwaffe's attempt to destroy the city had not only failed, it had created something even more powerful. From the ashes of Stalingrad rose a resolve that would change the course of the war. The Germans had thought they could break the Soviet spirit, but instead they had ignited it. In the end, the cost of bombing Stalingrad would be measured not just in the number of bombs dropped or the amount of destruction caused. It would be measured in the lives of the men, women, and children who fought to defend their city, who refused to yield even as their world was reduced to ashes. It would be measured in the way the city, though broken, had stood as a testament to the power of resistance, the power of hope, and the power of the human spirit to endure even the darkest days of war. The Luftwaffe may have destroyed Stalingrad, but in doing so, they had awakened a fury that would burn in the hearts of the defenders for the rest of the war. And in the end, it was that fury that would help the Soviets triumph over the German invaders. Part 6. The Encirclement, Soviet Counteroffensive, and the Battle for Survival. By November 1942, the German forces, after months of relentless advance, had stretched their lines to the breaking point. What had once seemed like an unstoppable juggernaut had now become vulnerable. The Germans, unable to account for the indomitable spirit of the Soviet defenders, had overextended their reach, and the Soviet High Command, led by Stalin, was ready to take advantage of this weakness. Operation Uranus, a daring and calculated counteroffensive, was about to change the course of the war. On November 19th, Soviet forces launched their bold counteroffensive, attacking the German Sixth Army from an unexpected direction through the weak flanks of the Axis forces. The Romanian and Hungarian units, stationed along the edges of the German lines, were considered expendable by the Nazis. These forces were poorly equipped, undertrained, and struggling to hold the line as the German Sixth Army pressed forward. The Soviets, knowing that the key to victory lay in exploiting this weakness, attacked the exposed flanks with overwhelming force. The German forces were stunned. The offensive quickly turned into a complete encirclement, and within days, the German Sixth Army found itself trapped inside Stalingrad, with no escape, no reinforcements, and no hope of rescue. The operation succeeded beyond even the most optimistic Soviet expectations. By November 23rd, the Germans had been completely encircled. The city of Stalingrad, which had once been a battleground between the Wehrmacht and Soviet defenders, had now become the tomb for the very soldiers who had believed they would conquer it. The German forces, once brimming with the confidence of their previous victories, now faced the harsh, grim reality of their situation. They were trapped, isolated in a city that had already endured months of destruction, and their supplies were quickly running out. They were about to face a winter that would be colder and more merciless than any they had ever experienced. The battle for survival had begun. General Friedrich Paulus, the commander of the German Sixth Army, once a rising star in the German military, found himself caught in the middle of a nightmare that no one had foreseen. Paulus had been given the responsibility of taking Stalingrad, a city of immense strategic importance. He had advanced confidently, believing that the Wehrmacht's military might was unbeatable. But now, trapped within the encirclement, Paulus was faced with an impossible decision: surrender or continue fighting in a hopeless situation. His request for reinforcements and supplies went unanswered by Adolf Hitler, who stubbornly insisted that the Sixth Army must hold its position at all costs. Hitler's refusal to allow any retreat sealed the fate of his soldiers, leaving Paulus to confront the impossible. Inside his makeshift command post, a small, windowless room in the heart of the German position, Paulus sat with his staff. The sound of the relentless Soviet artillery fire outside seemed to grow louder each day, as if to remind him of the increasingly dire situation. The icy winter winds howled through the cracks in the building, sending a biting chill through the men who huddled together, trying to keep warm. The room was lit by a single flickering candle, and the only sound, besides the distant rumble of artillery, was the low murmur of men talking in hushed tones, speaking of things that felt so distant now: home, families, peace. But peace was a far-off dream, one that had no place in the rubble-strewn hell of Stalingrad. Paulus had always been a man of principle, a soldier who had risen through the ranks based on his ability to think strategically. But now his mind was clouded with doubt. His heart weighed heavily with the burden of command. How could he justify the deaths of his men? How could he continue to lead them into battle, knowing that their chances of survival were diminishing with each passing hour? The decision he faced was not only one of military tactics, but one of morality. Should he continue to follow the orders of a distant dictator? Or should he take matters into his own hands and surrender, offering his men a chance at survival? The harsh winter winds were not the only thing that chilled Paulus's heart. It was the growing realization that he had no good options left. The German Sixth Army was surrounded, cut off from any means of resupply, and trapped within the decimated city. The soldiers, who had once marched into Stalingrad with pride and confidence, now wore the look of exhaustion and despair. Their once bright uniforms were tattered, and their boots were worn down from weeks of constant fighting. Their faces, pale and gaunt, reflected the hopelessness of their situation. The food rations, already scarce, had dwindled to almost nothing, and as winter tightened its grip, the cold began to gnaw at the men's bones. Many soldiers, weakened by hunger and cold, began to succumb to frostbite. Those who remained alive found themselves in a constant state of fear, not just from the Soviet artillery, but from the invisible threat of starvation and disease. Each day that passed, without reinforcements, without the possibility of escape, brought a new layer of despair. The soldiers began to break down, not just physically, but mentally as well. The morale, once high during the initial stages of the invasion, had deteriorated into a grim resignation. As the days turned into weeks, the realization that no help was coming began to set in. There was no escape, no hope. The city's defenders had turned every building into a fortress, and every street became an obstacle the Germans could not overcome. As winter settled in, the temperature in Stalingrad dropped to unbearable lows. The cold seeped into everything: the soldiers' clothing, the food, the very air they breathed. It was a deathly silence that hung over the city as both sides, exhausted from months of fighting, tried to find any warmth they could. The sounds of artillery fire, once a constant roar, had become less frequent, replaced by the eerie silence of men too cold to fight. The Soviet artillery continued to fire, relentlessly pounding the Germans with shells. The constant barrage made movement difficult. Even the most basic tasks, such as gathering food or caring for the wounded, became perilous, with the risk of death always lurking. The soldiers in Paulus's command knew that their position was untenable, but they could do nothing but endure. In these dire conditions, small acts of camaraderie began to emerge. Soldiers, even in the most desperate of situations, shared whatever little they had. Meager rations of bread were divided, and the warmth of human connection became as important as any weapon. At night, around small fires in the few sheltered spots left, men exchanged stories of home, of loved ones, and of better times. These stories, often full of longing and sadness, became lifelines for the soldiers, a fragile link to the world they had once known, a world that seemed so far away. But amidst the suffering, Paulus could not escape the nagging question that haunted him. Should he surrender? Should he give up the fight and save what was left of his men? The Soviet forces were closing in on all sides, and his troops were growing weaker by the day. He had seen the resolve of the Soviets, their willingness to die for their city, and he had come to respect their determination. But what could he do against an army that refused to yield, against a situation that seemed hopeless? His thoughts were interrupted by the crackle of the radio, a fleeting connection to the outside world. The voice on the other end was a familiar one, his superior officer, General Wilhelm von Paulus, but this time the voice was distant and cold. Hitler's orders were clear: hold the position at all costs. Reinforcements would not be coming, and there would be no retreat. For Paulus, the weight of that order felt unbearable. The German leadership, far removed from the reality on the ground, had given no thought to the dire situation of the Sixth Army. The voices on the radio grew increasingly desperate, but no help came. The days dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Paulus could see that the situation was untenable, but as he looked at the faces of his men, pale, hungry, and worn down by months of bitter fighting, he knew the decision was not his alone. The men who had trusted him were now looking to him for leadership, for a decision that would determine their fate. It was a decision that carried the weight of thousands of lives, a decision that no man should ever have to make. Amidst the cold, the hunger, and the fear, Paulus found a sliver of clarity. Surrender might not be a defeat. It might be the only chance to save his men from the inevitable death that awaited them. He could not send them to die for a cause that had already been lost. But could he live with the decision? The weight of it seemed unbearable. In the darkest days of the siege, as the German forces were on the brink of collapse, Paulus made his choice. He sent out a message to the Soviet forces, signaling his willingness to negotiate. The decision was not easy, but it was made with the lives of his men in mind. Perhaps surrender was not the end. Perhaps it was the only way to ensure that the men who had fought so bravely would have a chance at survival. As the new year approached, the German Sixth Army stood on the precipice of destruction, a shattered force caught in a battle of survival. The once proud soldiers of Stalingrad now found themselves fighting not for victory, but for the chance to live. General Paulus, facing the impossible decision of surrender or annihilation, held onto a faint hope that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit could endure. Part 7. The Winter of Despair. Struggling to survive in the frozen wastes. As winter descended upon Stalingrad, the situation for the German forces, already perilous, grew exponentially worse. What had started as an ill-fated attempt to capture a city already devastated by months of fierce fighting was now compounded by the unforgiving chill of the Russian winter. The temperatures plunged, and the once proud German Sixth Army, which had been at the peak of its strength in the summer, now found itself shackled by the very elements they had failed to prepare for. The battle that had raged in the streets and ruins of Stalingrad now extended to the bitter cold, a battle of survival that no one had anticipated. The frostbite, hunger, and disease ravaged both German and Soviet troops alike, but for the Germans trapped inside Stalingrad, the cold brought new horrors that threatened to extinguish any hope of victory. They had underestimated the Russian winter, just as they had underestimated the resilience of the Soviet people, and now it was a force in itself, unrelenting and merciless. The German soldiers, exhausted from months of constant combat, had been given little preparation for the conditions that awaited them. Their uniforms, which had once been adequate in the mild autumn, were woefully insufficient for the deep freeze that settled over the city. They lacked proper winter clothing, gloves, boots, and coats. As the temperature dropped below freezing, many soldiers who had been exposed for too long to the harsh winds and snow succumbed to frostbite. Their fingers and toes would turn black and swollen, and even the warmth of a fire could do little to reverse the damage done. Some men, after days of exposure, simply didn't wake up. They froze in their trenches, frozen to death in their positions before they could even think of retreating. For those who survived the cold, the situation hardly improved. Supplies were dwindling. The Germans had long since run out of food and medicine, and the once glorious supply lines had been severed by the Soviet encirclement. The food they had managed to scrounge together was hardly enough to sustain them, and disease spread like wildfire. Typhus, dysentery, and other afflictions were rampant, causing the already weakening German forces to deteriorate further. The streets of Stalingrad had been transformed into a frozen wasteland, and as the days grew longer and colder, it became increasingly clear that survival was the only thing worth fighting for. The once great German war machine was now a shadow of its former self, grinding down under the weight of the circumstances. The soldiers, who had been so sure of their victory only months before, now fought for the barest of necessities: food, warmth, and the hope that somehow they might make it out alive. Each day became a test of willpower. The bleakness of their existence seemed to stretch on endlessly. For every soldier who survived the cold, there was another who didn't. And each death, whether from frostbite, starvation, or disease, was a reminder that time was running out. The snow-covered landscape, now an unrecognizable ruin of shattered buildings and broken streets, offered no mercy. The once great city had been reduced to little more than rubble, and what little remained was covered in a heavy blanket of snow. The icy winds howled through the ruins, cutting like knives, making it feel as though the very air was hostile. The temperature was so low that even the sound of soldiers' footsteps on the frozen ground seemed muffled, as though the world itself had turned its back on them. The cries of the men, asking for warmth, food, and water, echoed through the empty streets, lost in the wind. But amidst the cruelty of this frozen hellscape, small acts of humanity began to emerge. In a place where survival had become a daily struggle, these moments of selflessness, of camaraderie, and shared suffering became the only things that made it bearable. Soldiers, many of whom had barely the energy to stand, still found ways to help each other. The little rations of bread, when they came, were shared. Soldiers who had no food themselves would still offer whatever scraps they had to their comrades, who were no better off. The bonds formed in these dire moments transcended nationality and allegiance. German soldiers, who had once fought against their Soviet counterparts with hate in their hearts, found themselves offering comfort and care to each other in ways they had never imagined. Their shared suffering turned them into a community, however fleeting it may have been, fighting for the same thing: survival. As the Germans huddled together in the frozen streets of Stalingrad, the Soviet forces outside continued to tighten their grip. The relentless Soviet artillery kept the pressure on the encircled German forces, preventing them from moving or retreating, while the Soviet troops themselves were gaining strength by the day. But for the German soldiers trapped in the city, the battle was no longer about territory. It had become a battle of willpower. Every day they fought to survive, to endure the cold, to hold on long enough for reinforcements to come, though they knew deep down that there would be no reinforcements. Desperation set in as the Germans tried to find ways to survive. The Luftwaffe had been called in to help with airdrops, but the mission was fraught with difficulties. The Soviets had set up an impressive anti-aircraft defense, making each airdrop an incredibly dangerous mission. The Luftwaffe pilots did their best, but with each drop, the supplies seemed to get smaller and smaller. The Germans had no choice but to adapt, to rely on whatever ingenuity they could muster. Soldiers scavenged through the rubble for anything that might help them endure. Makeshift stoves were crafted from scrap metal and old parts, designed to melt snow for water or to cook whatever scraps of food they could find. The soldiers melted snow for drinking water and boiled whatever bones or scraps they had left for sustenance. They used whatever materials they could scrounge to make crude repairs to their gear and clothing, fashioning anything from torn uniforms to broken equipment. Amidst this daily struggle, the human spirit refused to be fully extinguished. There were moments of extraordinary resilience, soldiers who, despite everything, refused to give up. In the depths of their despair, they found ways to keep going, even if only for one more day. The few remnants of normal life that remained, the brief moments when soldiers could sit by the fire and share a story from their past, became a source of comfort. They spoke of their families, of the peaceful days before the war, of dreams of home. These stories became lifelines for the men, tiny flickers of warmth in a world that had turned bitter and cold. As the year drew to a close, it was clear that the German Sixth Army was facing certain destruction. The Soviet forces had them trapped, and the winter had made any hope of escape seem impossible. But as the cold winds howled through the ruins of Stalingrad, the men clung to the faint hope that somehow they would survive. For some, it was the belief that reinforcements would come. For others, it was the hope of simply enduring long enough to see the end of the war. But that hope was fading with each passing day, and the future seemed as bleak and unforgiving as the frozen streets they trudged through. The Germans, once so confident in their victory, had become prisoners to the cold, to the siege, and to their own desperation. The soldiers who had been part of an unstoppable war machine now found themselves fighting a war that could not be won. In the desolate, frozen hell of Stalingrad, their strength was gone, their morale shattered, and their hope extinguished. The city, though reduced to rubble, had proven to be more than just a physical barrier. It had become an emotional and psychological prison, one that no amount of military strength could overcome. But amidst the unrelenting cold and the growing sense of inevitability, the human spirit found a way to endure. It was in these moments of suffering, of shared hardship, that the true nature of the battle was revealed, not as a contest of military strength, but as a test of the human will to survive, to resist, and to keep fighting against the cold, the hunger, and the darkness. As the winter of despair stretched on, it became clear that Stalingrad would not only be a battlefield where armies fought, it would become the defining moment in a war that would change the world. The soldiers, both German and Soviet, fought not just for their commanders, not just for their countries, but for the chance to live to see another day. Part 8. The Last Stand. The Fall of the Sixth Army. As the days of January 1943 wore on, the German Sixth Army found itself trapped deeper than ever, suffocating under the weight of its own desperation. Despite several desperate attempts to break free from the Soviet encirclement, the escape that had once seemed possible now seemed as distant as victory itself. Every effort to push through the Soviet lines had been met with brutal resistance. The Soviets had not only held their ground but were tightening their grip on the German forces, wearing them down physically and mentally. The encirclement, which had once been a hopeful tactic for the Soviets, had now become the German army's final prison. The bitter winter winds swept through the shattered remains of the city, bringing with them not only the sting of cold, but the haunting realization that no rescue was coming. General Friedrich Paulus, once a rising star in the German military, found himself at the center of an impossible situation. His army, once the pride of Nazi Germany, had been shattered, its morale crushed by the unrelenting Soviet siege, the frigid temperatures, and the constant lack of supplies. His officers, once full of hope and confidence, were now worn and defeated, their faces gaunt from hunger and exhaustion. Many of his soldiers had fallen ill or had succumbed to frostbite, and the few who remained capable of fighting were barely able to hold their positions. The reality of their situation was inescapable. No reinforcements would come. Hitler's orders to hold Stalingrad at all costs had proven disastrous, and there was no hope of breaking out. Supplies had long since run dry, and the once proud Sixth Army was reduced to scavenging through the ruins of the city, fighting not for victory, but simply to survive one more day. On the 31st of January 1943, after weeks of agonizing indecision, Paulus made the fateful decision to surrender. The decision came not with relief, but with a heavy heart. He was a man torn between duty and humanity, a soldier who had been brought to his knees by the very war he had once believed in. His options were gone, no help was coming, and no strategic maneuver could break the Soviet hold. He had led his men with honor, but now it was a question of whether they would die in vain or live to fight another day. The decision was not one taken lightly. Paulus had been a loyal officer in the German army, and his orders had been clear from the very start: take Stalingrad and do not retreat. But as the walls closed in, and with no possibility of relieving his men or providing them with food or medical supplies, the reality became undeniable. Stalingrad, for all its significance, was no longer a prize worth dying for. The cost of further resistance was too high, and he could not, in good conscience, lead his men into further destruction. At the moment of his decision, Paulus did not see a path to redemption or glory. He saw only the faces of his soldiers, men who had followed him with trust and courage but who were now broken, their spirits crushed by the endless bombardment, hunger, and the cold. He made the painful choice to surrender. The word was sent to the Soviet command, signaling the end of the battle and the fall of the Sixth Army. By the 2nd of February 1943, the last remnants of the German Sixth Army officially surrendered to the Soviet forces. Over 200,000 German soldiers were either killed or taken prisoner. The once formidable Sixth Army, which had been poised to capture Stalingrad and deliver a decisive blow to the Soviet Union, was now shattered, its soldiers scattered and broken. The city of Stalingrad, which had seen such intense and unyielding combat, was now the tomb of the Wehrmacht's pride. The surrender of the German Sixth Army marked a pivotal moment in the course of World War II. It was not just a defeat for the Germans. It was a devastating blow to the Nazi war machine, one that would have far-reaching consequences. The impact of the fall of Stalingrad was felt not only on the battlefield but throughout the world. In Germany, the news of the defeat came as a shock. It was a moment of reckoning, a sobering reminder of the war's grim realities. The once proud military that had swept across Europe was now in retreat. The German populace, which had been fed a steady diet of Nazi propaganda, could no longer deny the war's mounting toll. The defeat at Stalingrad contributed to growing disillusionment with the Nazi regime, and the once unshakable confidence in Hitler's leadership began to falter. For the Soviet Union, the victory at Stalingrad was a moment of triumph and a much-needed boost to morale. After months of suffering and retreat, the Soviet people saw their resilience pay off. The fall of Stalingrad, a city that had borne the name of their leader, Joseph Stalin, was a symbol of the Soviet will to survive. It was a testament to the courage and determination of the Red Army, which had been pushed to the brink of collapse but had refused to give in. The victory also marked a turning point on the Eastern Front. The Soviets, having seized the momentum, began to push the Germans back, starting a series of offensives that would eventually lead to the liberation of occupied territories and the ultimate downfall of Nazi Germany. The surrender of the Sixth Army and the fall of Stalingrad became a symbol of endurance and sacrifice. For the Soviet defenders, it was a victory that came at an immense cost. The city of Stalingrad had been reduced to rubble, its buildings shattered, and its streets littered with the bodies of both soldiers and civilians. But from the devastation, a new spirit had emerged, a spirit of resistance, of unyielding determination, and of an unwavering commitment to their homeland. In the aftermath, as the snow began to thaw and the long siege came to an end, the survivors began to rebuild. Stalingrad, though forever scarred by the horrors of war, became a symbol of hope. It stood as a testament to the strength of the human spirit, to the unbreakable resolve of those who fought to protect their homes and their families. The sacrifices of those who fought at Stalingrad, whether soldier or civilian, would never be forgotten. The battle for Stalingrad had not only broken the back of the German war machine, but it had also shown the world the immense cost of war. The city had been leveled, but the spirit of those who had defended it had never been stronger. Stalingrad was no longer just a city, it was a symbol of what could be achieved through sacrifice, unity, and the unyielding will to survive. As the Germans retreated and the Soviets began their offensive, the war was far from over. But the fall of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad has shifted the tide of history, and it marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. For the people of Stalingrad, the battle was not just about defeating the Germans. It was about survival, about proving that no matter how deep the wounds, no matter how severe the cost, the human spirit could endure. As they looked to the future, they knew that the road ahead would still be long and filled with suffering, but they had proven, through their blood, sweat, and tears, that they would not be broken. And that was a victory in itself. Part 9. Koltso, the last fight to end. In the final days of January 1943, the once unstoppable German Sixth Army, which had been trapped in Stalingrad for months, faced its inevitable demise. The Soviet Union, having successfully encircled the German forces, launched a final, crushing offensive called Operation Koltso, a name that referred to the ring of Soviet forces tightening around the German Sixth Army like an iron noose. The goal was clear: completely annihilate the trapped German forces and bring an end to the bloodshed in Stalingrad. The operation was carried out by the Soviet Don Front, bolstered by reinforcements from 3 full armies that had been pulled from the disbanded Stalingrad front. This reinvigorated Soviet force was ready to finish the job and deal a fatal blow to the Germans. On January 9th, 1943, the Soviet High Command issued an ultimatum to the German forces: surrender, and they would guarantee the safety of prisoners. The Soviets promised that any captured soldiers would be treated humanely, with the added assurance that, after the war, they could be repatriated to Germany or any third country of their choice. The message was direct, yet full of compassion, an appeal to the humanity left in the besieged soldiers. Yet, the German response was one of defiance. As the Soviets raised their white flag, signaling the terms of surrender, the Germans rejected the offer. The refusal came as no surprise. Hitler, with his iron grip on the Wehrmacht, would never allow his forces to surrender, no matter the dire circumstances. The Nazi leadership remained resolute in their stubbornness, unaware that this decision would be the beginning of the end for their prideful army in Stalingrad. The next morning, on January 10th, 1943, the Soviets unleashed their fury. Over 7,000 artillery pieces, including guns and mortars, roared into action. A wave of firepower descended on the German positions, showering them with a devastating barrage of shells. The unrelenting assault sent shockwaves through the German lines. The attack marked the beginning of a full-scale Soviet advance from the west, which would come to an almost relentless halt only a week later. From January 17th to the 22nd, the Soviet forces paused their offensive to reorganize and consolidate their positions. This brief respite was not a retreat, but a careful preparation for the final push. As the Red Army reformed, the German forces, already weakened by months of siege, struggled to maintain any semblance of cohesion. Their fortifications, once thought to be impenetrable, were now shattered under the weight of Soviet artillery and air superiority. The environment of Stalingrad, once a place of fierce defense, had become a deadly trap from which there was no escape. By January 22nd, the attack resumed, and this time it was more ferocious than before. The Soviets launched a series of pincer movements, cutting the German Sixth Army in half. The two remaining sections of the once proud force were isolated, surrounded, and doomed. The southern part of the German Sixth Army was obliterated by January 31st, leaving nothing behind but scorched earth and the dead. The remnants of the German leadership, including the headquarters of the Sixth Army and General Paulus himself, were captured by Soviet forces. The command structure that had once believed they would take Stalingrad was now at the mercy of their enemies. On February 2nd, 1943, the remaining forces of the German Sixth Army, trapped and broken, surrendered to the Soviets. In total, more than 200,000 German soldiers, as well as 2 Romanian divisions and a Croatian regiment, were either killed or taken prisoner. The once feared Sixth Army, which had been at the forefront of the German advance into the Soviet Union, was now decimated, its commanders captured and its soldiers in Soviet custody. The surrender at Stalingrad was not just a military defeat for Germany, it was a symbolic moment that sent shockwaves through the entire Axis power structure. It marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. The psychological blow to the Germans was immense, as their greatest military force on the Eastern Front had been utterly destroyed. The loss was more than just a failure of military tactics. It was a blow to German morale and a devastating reminder that the Soviet Union, though once thought to be on the brink of collapse, was stronger than ever. For the Soviet Union, the victory at Stalingrad was a moment of immense pride and relief. The victory galvanized the Red Army, and the psychological boost it gave to the Soviet people was immeasurable. Stalingrad, which had been a symbol of Soviet resistance and suffering, now became a symbol of Soviet resilience and triumph. The victory set the stage for a series of offensives that would eventually lead the Red Army all the way to Berlin. The loss of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad meant that the Axis powers had lost their initiative and the Soviets were ready to take the fight to them. In Germany, the impact of the defeat at Stalingrad was felt across the nation. The German public, who had been fed a steady diet of propaganda and victory, could no longer deny the truth. The loss was devastating, and the German leadership, particularly Hitler, could no longer disguise the scale of the defeat. While the Nazi regime continued to push on with the war, the morale of the German people began to waver. The defeat at Stalingrad shattered the myth of invincibility that had surrounded the Wehrmacht. For the first time, the German military and the civilian population were confronted with the reality that the war was not winnable, and the tide was turning against them. For the world, Stalingrad's fall was a pivotal moment that reshaped the entire course of World War II. The defeat of the German Sixth Army marked a dramatic shift in the balance of power, with the Soviet Union rising as the dominant force in the East. The Allies too felt the ripple effect, knowing that the Red Army's advance would eventually lead to the liberation of Eastern Europe and the ultimate downfall of the Nazi regime. The victory at Stalingrad not only shifted the momentum on the Eastern Front, but also cemented the role of the Soviet Union as a superpower on the global stage. The aftermath of Stalingrad was a moment of reflection. The city, once a symbol of Soviet resilience, lay in ruins. But from the ashes of destruction arose the unyielding spirit of the Soviet people. The impact of the battle was far-reaching, altering the strategies of war and shaping the future of international relations. Stalingrad became more than just a military victory, it became a symbol of endurance, sacrifice, and the resilience of the human spirit. As the world moved toward the final years of the war, the lessons of Stalingrad would continue to resonate, shaping the course of history for generations to come. Part 10. The Aftermath. The impact of Stalingrad on World War II and the world. The Battle of Stalingrad, a name that reverberates through history, marked not just a military victory, but a seismic shift in the course of World War II. For months, the city had been reduced to rubble, and the relentless battle between German and Soviet forces seemed endless. Yet, as winter deepened in early 1943, the tide of war began to turn. The German Sixth Army, once unstoppable, was now broken, its remnants trapped and surrounded, forced into an impossible situation. The surrender of the German forces marked a definitive turning point, halting the Nazi advance deep into the Soviet Union and setting the stage for the eventual downfall of Nazi Germany. The psychological and strategic consequences of the Battle of Stalingrad rippled through both the Axis and Allied powers, altering the course of the war in ways no one could have anticipated. For Germany, the defeat at Stalingrad shattered the myth of invincibility that had propelled Hitler and the Wehrmacht forward. The German army, once seen as an unstoppable force, now faced the reality of its vulnerability. The battle had exposed serious flaws in Hitler's leadership, particularly his insistence on holding positions at any cost and his refusal to allow strategic retreats. The loss at Stalingrad not only crushed the morale of the German troops, but also led to growing dissent within the ranks. Officers who had once been loyal to the Führer began to question his judgment, and as the war effort continued to unravel, the cracks in Nazi leadership became ever more apparent. The psychological toll on the German people was just as devastating. News of the defeat at Stalingrad spread throughout Germany, and for the first time, the reality of the war's horrors hit home. The German public, which had been fed a steady stream of Nazi propaganda, portraying the war as a righteous crusade, could no longer deny the scale of their losses. The once unquestioned support for Hitler began to erode. The soldiers who had fought so hard, who had been promised victory and glory, now returned as broken men, their spirits shattered by the cold winter and the horrors they had endured. The defeat at Stalingrad shattered not only the army's morale, but the psyche of the German nation itself. Meanwhile, for the Soviet Union, the victory at Stalingrad was nothing short of monumental. It provided a much-needed psychological boost to the Soviet people and the Red Army, whose morale had been severely tested throughout the early years of the war. The victory proved that the Nazis could be defeated, that the Soviet Union could stand strong against the might of the German war machine. It also galvanized the resolve of Soviet leadership, particularly Joseph Stalin, whose earlier blunders had nearly led to the collapse of the Soviet state. Stalingrad was not just a battle won, it was a symbol of Soviet strength, unity, and resilience. It proved that the Soviet people, despite their suffering, would fight to the bitter end for their country. This victory would serve as a rallying cry for the Red Army, who, after Stalingrad, would push forward with relentless force toward Berlin. The psychological impact of Stalingrad, however, extended far beyond the Eastern Front. It reshaped strategic priorities across the globe and began to shift the very foundation of wartime alliances. In the wake of the victory, the Soviet Union emerged as a major force in the Allied coalition, and the balance of power between the major Allied powers began to shift. The defeat of the German Sixth Army not only crippled the Wehrmacht, but also opened the door for the Soviet Union to launch a series of offensives that would eventually lead to the liberation of Eastern Europe. The Red Army's advance into German-held territory marked the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. On the other side of the world, the Allies, particularly Britain and the United States, recognized the importance of the Soviet victory. Although tensions existed between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union, particularly over differing ideologies, the triumph at Stalingrad helped solidify the partnership between them. The Soviet resilience on the Eastern Front gave the Western Allies newfound confidence in the defeat of the Axis powers. As the war continued, coordination among the Allies increased, and the various fronts, ranging from the Eastern Front to the Mediterranean to the Pacific, became more synchronized. This new unity in purpose and direction was critical to the ultimate success of the Allied war effort. The battle also had a profound impact on the development of military strategy. Stalingrad marked a fundamental shift in the way battles were fought, particularly in urban warfare. The brutal, close-quarters combat that characterized the fighting in the city was unlike anything seen before. The importance of adapting tactics to the environment became clear as the narrow streets and rubble-filled buildings of Stalingrad turned the city into a maze of traps and ambush points. The battle emphasized the need for infantry and snipers to be integrated into urban combat operations, as mobility and heavy artillery were less effective in the confines of city streets. Both sides learned harsh lessons in the art of urban warfare, lessons that would influence military doctrine for decades to come. The intensity of the battle also led to innovations in the use of technology and tactics. The Soviets, for instance, began to make more effective use of their tanks in the city's narrow streets, employing them as mobile firing platforms rather than traditional shock troops. The role of snipers, too, was amplified, with Soviet marksmen becoming both feared and revered for their ability to eliminate high-value targets from a distance. The psychological warfare of sniping in Stalingrad, combined with the constant artillery bombardment, was a harrowing experience for the German forces. The lessons of Stalingrad influenced military academies around the world, with its study becoming a cornerstone of urban warfare tactics. Yet, for all the strategies and tactics, the human cost of Stalingrad was staggering. It is difficult to comprehend the scale of the destruction and the toll it took on both sides. More than 2 million people, soldiers and civilians alike, lost their lives in the battle. The city itself was left in ruins, its once thriving factories and homes reduced to piles of rubble. It was a haunting testament to the brutality of modern warfare, a city destroyed not only physically but spiritually. And yet, from the wreckage, stories of heroism and resilience emerged, stories that would shape national narratives for generations to come. The human cost of Stalingrad extended beyond the immediate battlefield. Millions of soldiers, civilians, and their families were affected by the battle, and the scars of this conflict would last long after the war ended. The emotional and psychological toll on the survivors was profound. For many, the loss of Stalingrad marked not just a military defeat, but the loss of their homes, their families, and their way of life. The survivors of Stalingrad, whether they were soldiers or civilians, would carry the weight of that experience with them for the rest of their lives, haunted by memories of the destruction and loss they had witnessed. In Germany, the defeat at Stalingrad had a profound effect on the public. It was no longer possible to deny the reality of the war, and for the first time, the German people were confronted with the sheer scale of the losses their country had sustained. The defeat at Stalingrad led to a shift in public opinion, with many beginning to question Hitler's leadership and the war effort. The loss in Stalingrad was the beginning of a long road to eventual defeat for Nazi Germany. For the Soviet Union, however, the victory at Stalingrad became a symbol of the strength and resilience of the Soviet people. It galvanized the Red Army and gave them the momentum they needed to continue pushing westward, retaking territory from the Axis forces. The victory at Stalingrad, along with subsequent victories on the Eastern Front, helped to redefine the Soviet Union's role on the world stage. The Soviet Union emerged from the war as a global superpower, and the impact of Stalingrad on Soviet national identity cannot be overstated. In the broader scope of the war, the Battle of Stalingrad was not just a military victory, it was a decisive moment that altered the course of history. It shifted the momentum of the war in favor of the Allies, reshaping the strategic priorities of the Axis and the Allies alike. As the world watched the Soviet Union stand firm against the German war machine, the Allies gained renewed confidence in their ability to defeat the Axis powers. Stalingrad was a turning point in World War II, one that shaped the future of global politics and warfare. Today, the Battle of Stalingrad remains a symbol of resilience, sacrifice, and the enduring spirit of those who fought there. The battle marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, and its legacy continues to influence military strategy, international relations, and historical memory. In the years that followed, the world would rebuild and heal, but the lessons learned at Stalingrad of survival, unity, and the cost of war would never be forgotten. Conclusion: Reflections and Legacy of Stalingrad. The Battle of Stalingrad left deep scars on the people who fought it, and the city itself. Though Stalingrad lay in ruins, the victory achieved by the Soviet forces symbolized the resilience and determination of the human spirit. The Battle of Stalingrad remains etched in history as one of the most brutal and decisive engagements of World War II. Fought between the Axis powers led by Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, it stretched from August 1942 to February 1943, claiming over 2 million lives, both soldiers and civilians. What started as a quest for strategic dominance over the Soviet Union turned into an unimaginable battle of attrition. In the end, Stalingrad would be more than just a city. It would become a symbol of survival, resistance, and the unyielding will of those who fought in it. When Adolf Hitler set his sights on Stalingrad, he was not only targeting a key Soviet industrial city, but also one with a deeply symbolic significance. Named after Joseph Stalin, the city represented the heart of Soviet resistance. Capturing it, Hitler believed, would deal a crushing blow to Soviet morale and deal a decisive blow to the Soviet war effort. The German strategy was to advance toward the Volga River, crush the Soviet forces in southern Russia, and ultimately seize the Caucasus oil fields, which were vital for the Nazi war machine. But what was meant to be a swift and easy conquest quickly turned into a nightmare for the invading forces. The Germans had underestimated the resolve of the Soviet Union, and Stalingrad, with its rubble-filled streets and broken buildings, would not fall easily. Soviet leadership, especially that of Joseph Stalin, commanded that the city be held at all costs. This unyielding resolve was encapsulated in Stalin's infamous order, "Not one step back." What followed was one of the most grueling and intense urban battles ever fought. For the German forces, led by General Friedrich Paulus and the Sixth Army, the invasion turned into a bloody, desperate struggle. The Luftwaffe launched horrific bombing raids on the city, reducing it to rubble, but despite the relentless airstrikes, the Soviets held their ground. For months, the two armies fought fiercely over each building, each street corner, and every inch of ground. Snipers hid in the ruins, infantrymen fought in hand-to-hand combat, and both sides launched relentless counterattacks. The fighting turned Stalingrad into a nightmarish battlefield, an urban wasteland where survival itself became the ultimate victory. Amidst the chaos, the city's civilian population faced unimaginable hardship. Women, children, and elderly civilians were thrust into the heart of the war. They were forced to become part of the Soviet war effort, carrying supplies, evacuating the wounded, and even taking up arms to defend their homes. For many civilians, survival meant fighting alongside the Red Army, living in basements, and hoping for a miracle. While soldiers fought in the streets, civilians fought just to exist. The human cost of this battle was enormous, with civilians enduring the same brutality as the soldiers. The German army too faced dire conditions. As winter set in, the once proud Sixth Army found itself isolated and encircled by Soviet forces. What had been a fast-moving advance became a slow, suffocating death trap. General Paulus's request for reinforcements and supplies went unanswered by Adolf Hitler, who refused to authorize a retreat. Trapped in the city, the German soldiers faced starvation, disease, and the relentless cold. As temperatures plunged well below freezing, frostbite took its toll, and German troops who had once seemed invincible were left fighting for their lives in conditions they could not have imagined. The horrors of winter, combined with the constant Soviet pressure, made escape impossible. For the Soviet forces, it was not just about defending a city, it was about defending their nation and survival itself. The Soviet High Command, under Stalin's direct orders, launched a counter-offensive in November 1942, which would change the course of the battle. The encirclement of the German Sixth Army, now known as Operation Uranus, trapped the invaders inside Stalingrad. With their lines of supply cut off, the Germans found themselves in a hopeless situation. They were now fighting not only the Soviet forces but also the harsh Russian winter. The once great Sixth Army, which had been poised to break the Soviet resistance, was now on the brink of total collapse. As the siege of Stalingrad wore on, the resolve of both the German and Soviet soldiers was tested to their breaking point. For the Germans, it was a fight against starvation, freezing conditions, and a relentless enemy that refused to give up. For the Soviets, it was a matter of national survival if Stalingrad fell. The Germans would continue their advance, and the heart of the Soviet Union would be vulnerable. The victory at Stalingrad would symbolize the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, as it marked the first major defeat for Hitler's forces on the Eastern Front. By the 31st of January 1943, General Paulus, facing certain destruction, made the decision to surrender. On the 2nd of February 1943, the remnants of the German Sixth Army finally capitulated to Soviet forces. The battle, which had raged for over 5 months, was finally over. Stalingrad was in ruins, but the Soviet victory marked a crucial turning point in World War II. The Germans had lost over 200,000 soldiers, and the psychological blow to the Nazi regime was immense. More than 2 million people had died in the battle, making it one of the deadliest military engagements in history. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad not only halted the German advance, but also set the stage for the Red Army's long and relentless push westward. The defeat shattered the myth of Nazi invincibility and provided a morale boost that would fuel the Soviet war effort for years to come. On the other hand, for the Germans, the loss at Stalingrad was the first major sign of their eventual defeat. The battle revealed critical weaknesses in Hitler's strategy and began the long road to the fall of Nazi Germany. As we reflect on the battle, we must remember the extraordinary sacrifices made by both soldiers and civilians. The untold stories of survival, bravery, and resilience in the face of overwhelming odds speak not only to the horrors of war but to the strength of the human spirit. The Battle of Stalingrad was not just a military victory. It was a testament to the will to survive against all odds. In the years since, the legacy of Stalingrad has lived on as a symbol of resistance, a reminder of the cost of war, and a reflection on the endurance of the human will to survive. Today, Stalingrad's name resonates as a powerful reminder of the courage and sacrifices made by those who lived and died there. Thank you for joining me as we've explored the brutal and unforgettable history of the Battle of Stalingrad. If you found this video informative and engaging, please hit that like button, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more.